very rightly with a few thoughts in relation to our two former compatriots, Donal Dolan and Martin Nocton. Donal turned 50 on the 13th of October 2016. Martin left us early that afternoon. I think it shows the good grace of Donal that 2 days later, when people will never forget how he spoke about Martin in the church in Baldoyle, that he had the good grace not to mention that Martin had spoiled his 50th birthday. Both of them from the West. Both of them I would describe as that strong wind of inclusion and a wind that ruffles that came from the West. We get all our weather in Ireland comes from the West. I think Donal gave us the cold, hard wind. That was his way. He was in many ways he was an outsider. He saw things were absolutely wrong, and he went for them. Martin had a different style. Martin would be sitting in the tent with you, pouring your tea, and then he'd turn the screw on you. But so that's a little bit about their, if you like, their personalities. What they were absolutely united on was an experience of growing up, as it were, one in Spiddle in Galway, one outside Ballyhaunis, both from small farms, growing up in a world that couldn't understand them as ordinary children, never mind as people with a disability. That informed them, and the insights that they struggled through themselves, obviously, in relation to that, helped to form them. And they broke through that. And I think listening to people with disabilities at both their funerals and afterwards, the thing that struck was, it was Donal that put a bit of steel in me. It was Martin that woke me up, gave me the gumption. And that's the essence. And I think that's the call also to each one of us, to be lightning rods, to be a signpost, to be an inspiration to people around us. Often people that you just randomly meet, rather than that you maybe address at a conference or something like that. And I think that's an important part of the legacy that they've given us. The moment that I heard about both their deaths, I was in my office. We were just about to start a board meeting. My chairperson, Pat Clark, was with me, and a text came through on my phone last October, and it just said, "Our beloved Martin has passed." And that was from one of his, I'll say his personal assistants, but that doesn't describe the relationship that Martin had with the people that made his life work for him 24 hours a day, every day of the week. On the Monday the 24th, I got a WhatsApp message from my daughter, Ruth, who's studying in DCU, and she was the first to tell me that Donal had died. And she said, "Daddy, this is weird. I've just been reading a chapter in a book that Donal wrote, and the book was Social Policy in Relation to Disability in Ireland." And of course, you begin to think then about the impact that these people have had and will next year and the following year. Look, it's often traditional. I'm going to leave this piece here just to say two things. Number one, both of them were adjunct professors in the Centre for Disability and Law Policy in Galway with Gerard Quinn. The second thing I'll say is it's often traditional to have a moment's silence. I think, given the nature of why we're here today and what we're about, let their spirit and what they were about and their different personalities be a reflection for us throughout the day and to take from the day. Martin, being from Galway, had some good days here in Croke Park. Poor Dolan, being from Mayo, is still is still hoping for them. So look, will we leave them their rest and the gift they gave to us? Be appreciative for it. Let me move on then. Gerard Quinn, people will know him as the professor of this, that and the other, and all his academic work and the various things and involvement in the creation and the making of the convention, etc. He was also, and is also, a world champion accordion player. My bio was read out, but what could have been said, if I had put it down there, is that I trained the first All-Ireland senior men's rounders team that won its All-Ireland in 1976, just out there. The point I'm making is every single one of us, actually not every single one of us, but every single one of us should be able to have multiple ideas. To be a real child, adult, older person, not to simply be a client all my life, a service user all my life, to be a player, to be a performer, to be a creator of something. Doesn't matter what it is, to be a doer. And I think that's I would pick up from what Monica said about dignity. Isn't that the bedrock of your dignity as a human person, that you can be somebody? Across, to be a parent, to be a grandparent, to be an uncle, to be a brother, to have been part of your community, to be part of, to be someone that others can go to for support. I think that's the greatest denial of the way that we have traditionally engaged with people with disabilities. There's a cultural shift, I think, that's needed. I'll quickly mention it in terms of a couple of different domains. Very recently in the Senate, we had the bus air strike, and one of the routes they closed down was they closed down 3 routes that bus air would no longer service, but private companies would. And the idea was that that was fine. There was still enough capacity, enough seats to deal with the demand that was there. Right? Lovely. The Minister, the Department, and the National Transport Authority, who actually advised that this was a practical option, didn't stop to think, oh, all the bus air buses are wheelchair accessible. I wonder, are the private operator buses wheelchair accessible? Answer, not one of them. And worse, there wasn't an obligation that one of them would be, even though they have a public service contract. That's a cultural shift that badly needs to happen there. In the late 40s, we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, December 48. 58 years later, and I can't see it in any other way, 58 years later, the Convention. If the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which basically said, as Monica has already animated what she said, all people have rights because they're people, because they're human beings. There's no more to it. Black, white, this, that, from this part of the world, that part, doesn't matter. As a human being, therefore you have rights. How come over 6 decades, after the horrors of the Second World War and what was done to some people, that couldn't be embedded in relation to people with disabilities? So in many ways I see the Convention as an acceptance of the world wanting to do the right thing but absolutely not being able to do it for people with disabilities. Let me mention some other thing, and I don't want to be gruesome or grim about this. The Nazis brought in the Nuremberg laws to systematically dehumanize a group of people. They took their money, they froze their bank accounts, they made them stand out, put a Star of David on them, they stopped them having public office, they stopped them having professions, they humiliated them in public, they told them you can't sit on that bench. At the same time, they developed a program to kill people with disabilities, a euthanasia program. They didn't have to bring in any legislation. They didn't have to have a whole program of propaganda against people with disabilities. Now, this is the frightening thing. Why was that not necessary? I sometimes am involved in the Holocaust commemoration every year. Sometimes I've been asked to give the few words in relation to people with disabilities. 300,000 people with disabilities perished through their T4 program. Right? Not a bother for that to happen. And that's the important thing for us to think of. How do we embed the sheer ordinary humanity of people who happen to have a disability? I need to finish now, and I'm going to reference Robbie Sinnott, who's coming on later. It's doing a piece of work I'll be doing in a minute. Another example of somebody who very recently, in a republic, in a democracy, where if you want to say anything is sacred, it must be that you can vote confidentially. It's not that, oh, well, sure, he won't mind, and da-da-da. That's not the point of it. It is the cornerstone. Your vote is yours and yours alone, and you can do it privately in any way you like. Robbie, through his work, unearthed the fact, which we already knew, it's guaranteed in the Constitution. The department relevant should have been bringing in the legislation. The cost of doing it is pretty minimal, and yet it didn't happen. So look, I'm going to leave it at that. Beg your indulgence for going slightly over time. Thank you.